Useful expressions in English presentation.
1.
Starting your presentation, greeting the audience. Good morning. Good afternoon. Good evening. Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending. Name of your presentation, your name and position. Let me start by introducing myself. I am from name of your company.
I'm in charge of.
I'm responsible for. At your department's name or organization's name. Subject of the presentation. The subject of my presentation is. The subject of my talk is. Today I'd like to speak about. Today I am here to talk to you about. The goal of your presentation. The objective of this presentation is to present. The purpose of this presentation is to. Main parts, or the presentation outline. I've divided my talk into 3 main parts. I've split my talk into 3 main sections. First, I will talk about. Second, we will look at. Third, we will move on to. I'll start with. Then I will cover them. Next, I will explain.
And finally, we will look into.
Reason to listen. By the end of the presentation, you'll know how to. By the end of this talk, you will have learned about.
2.
Signaling. Putting ideas in order. First, second, third, then.
Next, finally.
Transition to body. Let me start with some background information. I'd like to give you some background information. Let me begin by explaining. Now let's move on to the first part of my talk. Now let's turn to the first part of my talk. Introducing main point.
Here, I would like to talk about the.
Now, I will discuss. Now, let's look at. Transition to next main point. Now let's move on to. Now let's turn to. I'd now like to move on to the next part. I'd now like to move on to the next topic. Now I want to describe. Next, I will focus on. Adding ideas. In addition to this.
Moreover. However. Despite this. So, therefore.
Going back to something you have already spoken about. Let me now return to. Let me now come back to. As I said at the beginning, this relates to what I was saying earlier. Examples. For example, as an illustration, to illustrate this point, a good example of this is, to give you an example, details. I'd like to expand on this aspect. I'd like to expand on this point. I'd like to expand on this problem. Let me elaborate further on. Reference to sources. Based on our findings, according to our study, our data shows, our data indicates them, graphs and images. I'd like to illustrate this point by showing you. I think the graph perfectly shows that.
3.
Highlighting and emphasizing. Focusing attention on an important point. I'd like to emphasize that. It should be emphasized that. I should repeat that. We have to remember that. Another significant point is that. Paraphrasing. In other words. To put it in another way. So what I'm saying is that. Analyzing. Let's look at this more closely. What does this mean exactly? Contrast. Actually. In fact. In reality. Ways of using. What? What we can do is. What we have been able to do is. What is really important is.
4.
Closing a presentation. Signaling the end of the presentation. Okay, that brings me to the end of my presentation. Right. That covers everything I wanted to say about. So, that's all I have to say. Summarizing. To sum up. In brief. I'd like to recap the main points. Before I finish, let me just go over. I'd like to end with a summary of the main points. Concluding. To conclude, I'd like to say that. I'd like to finish by saying. In conclusion. In my opinion. I recommend that we. I suggest that we. Closing. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening so attentively. I hope this has been useful. That concludes my talk for today. Inviting questions. Are there any questions? I'd be glad to answer any questions. So, do you have any questions? Yes, miss. Yes, mister. Yes, the gentleman sitting there. Yes, the lady sitting there.
5.
Handling questions. Some question formats you might hear. Are you saying that? What did you mean when you said? Could you go over? Again, please? I didn't understand the part about. Positive response. Thank you for asking that question. That's a good question. That's a difficult question. That's an interesting question. Clarifying to make sure you understand the audience member's question. You're asking me about. Is that right? Sorry, I didn't follow the question. Sorry, I didn't catch the question. Could you please repeat the question? Could you rephrase that for me? Could you speak more slowly? Accepting audience criticism. I accept that. I agree with what you're saying. Up to a point, I agree.
Useful expressions.
For handling questions that are outside your area or field. I'm afraid I can't really answer that. That's not really my area, I'm afraid. That's not really my field, I'm afraid. I'm afraid that's confidential. I'd be glad to discuss it with you personally after the presentation. Checking if your answer was understood. Does that answer your question? Is that okay? Is that clear now? Can we move on to the next question?
6.
Engaging your audience. Directing questions. What does this mean? Why am I telling you this? Why am I showing you this? Can you see the problem? What do you think happened next? Why do you think this happened? Talking about interesting facts. Did you know that? According to a recent study, statistics show that. Offer clarification. Is that clear? Are there any questions about that?
It is important to note, however, that your tone of voice while asking the questions above says a lot about you as a speaker. Remember that you want your audience to fully understand and appreciate your presentation. So, always ask with a polite tone of voice